this is so interesting, is that, like, things get settled in terms of the scientific discourse, but there's a whole bunch of problems that still kind of get left on the margins and don't really get talked about. And so I had done this, like, it was weird. I was working on some stuff with, like, with language and the way that language modifies certain physiological states, and epigenetics, and just thinking about how, what the relationship would be in terms of the interpretation of experience and how that feeds into epigenetic switching. So anyway, I was working on this thing, and I wrote up this little side paper, just a short little essay, basically outlining that I thought that, given epigenetics, there was a mechanism where experience could factor into genetic mutation. And so if this was right, then evolution was probably non-random, or at least parts of evolution were probably non-random. And so, I put this up, and then I put it back on the shelf. I wasn't looking at it or dealing with it anymore. And if I had gone and presented that to any evolutionary biology department anywhere, this is so radical, so heretical, you would have got laughed out of the room. But then, I don't know, maybe late last year, a study comes out of Haifa, Israel, where they were looking at malaria adaptation in a group, with some group in Africa, and they found basically that non-random mutation occurs, and this was a very solid finding, and been replicated since then. And then there was another study that came out at the same time in the University of Arizona, which showed that certain parts of the genome were more malleable to adaptation than others. So there's highly conserved parts that are very rigid in terms of their inability to be modified genetically. But then there's other parts that are more, like, your immune system is much more adaptive and malleable. And so both of these together we're basically looking at and deciding something non-random evolution. Well, if it's non-random evolution, then you're in a whole different world of evolutionary theory. It's like, it's not really Lamarckianism, but it's more Lamarck-ish, because you're talking about how experience can actually modify the genes, even within the transmission of one generation, especially if it's something that's really malleable. So it's just, people take up these really rigid positions in terms of defense, and they do that when they're opposed to, like, so you have evolutionists, right, and then you have another group of young Earth creationist people, and then they solidify their positions in opposition to each other, but
they're battling to the end, aren't they?
Well, they get so rigid in defending what they think is right about their position, but what happens is it closes off both sides from actually being able to look at and to consider, well, maybe there's a piece here that's.
Have you seen that study they did about the rice studies, where they poured the water and the rice in different cups?
I mean,
and then they would say different words, like, you're beautiful, you're beautiful, you're beautiful. And the rice would be nice and luscious. And then they would tell the other one, you're ugly, you're disgusting, you're deplorable, yeah. You're horrible, you're an insurrectionist. And that rice went rotten and ugly and disgusting. Did you see that one?
I have seen that.
I don't know if that's a scam thing or not, but it's interesting.
I don't know. Did you do the rice experiment? I didn't.
No, but I was just thinking, if that is true, that would explain, if Jesus in God's word is what keeps reality vibrating in that same spoken word, holding up reality itself, that would say that it's a loving word that's being said. Otherwise, we would have withered away and decayed, and life would cease to exist, because God is speaking a loving word underneath the fabric of reality.
That is beautiful. So beautiful.
Why would that same God create Tyrannosaurus Rex? That was what I was asking earlier.
Well, Tyrannosaurus Rex has some majesty to him. I mean, you can't say that. Well, you want to, this is the radical break of the monotheism of the Bible in comparison with, say, something like the dualism that was prominent in other religions. The dualism would go and say, okay, well, gazelle's good, mosquito is clearly bad, right? Like, those are evil. So you'd go through the list of creatures and you'd say, well, this is good and this is evil and this is good and this is, and the Bible radically, even down to the creeping things and the weird things, like, they go, oh, no, this is good too. And so to say that everything that is created is good is a radical movement in the Bible.
Speaking of dinosaurs, in the new Jurassic World, they had to bring in the new one that came out. This is a spoiler, but they had to bring in this plant-based dinosaur to be one of the champion dinosaurs at the end that can stand toe-to-toe with T-Rex and the other baddies, because it's like, and they did this because they had to show people Like you could
You're
be a
joking.
bad.
This isn't a real.
This is a real thing. I'm telling you, everything I get, you can learn all of Girardianism by watching these box office films. It's true. Because they're reflective of the culture we're in, and they're trapped within this gospel stumbling block that they can't stop like working out. So like they have to show that the plant-based dinosaurs can also be
That's the
strong
goodie.
and powerful,
Yeah.
and they can
Yeah.
swipe
Yeah.
and they can swipe down big bad monsters just as well as T-Rex. So it's really interesting. I was like, I know they did that. I
Yeah.
know they did that, just like they had to the original characters, the man and the woman, there's a big age gap. And they said that was a problematic issue in the 90s movie because that was like
Between which characters is there a big
Ellie
age gap?
Sattler, the blonde girl, Laura Dern's character, and Alan Grant, the Sam Neill's character.
But there wasn't really a big age gap
But
between
there was like 15, 20 years or something like that. I don't know. But they said that was like a sign of a problematic patriarchy from the original 90s Spielberg film. And so in the new one, they had to make it very clear that, like the Alan Grant character saying, I will follow you wherever you go, Ellie. Like, I'm just going to be your little follower and you're the leader. And I'm just going to, and they had to make sure that, and it's like, why do they have to spend so much didactic time preaching and putting object lessons into every little character? Why can't they just focus on good storytelling and just really clever writing and stuff,
Well,
because they're just so desperate to proselytize, which is a sign that victimism is weakening, it's not holding up its hegemonic power, because you've got this, it's like when you watch the 90s evangelical movies like Bible Man. I don't know if you ever saw that.
I never saw Bible Man.
These movies are they're very proselytizing. Every scene is a freaking object lesson. You can't just let a good whimsical story develop and have really, and that's the problem, is that when that was happening, that wasn't a sign that the moral majority was very confident and relaxed and powerful. It was a sign that they were in retreat and they were desperate when they would put a piece of film together to make sure they could shove down their worldview to the listeners or viewers. And the same thing's happening today in Hollywood.
Do you think they were just really? Do you think they were just really bad artists? I think it might
that's
be
part of it. But you would attract really good artists if your worldview was very confident.
Well, yeah, no, I think
because they want to share in that. They want to share in that confident energy and the charisma of storytelling.
Yeah, I think that's right. But like, if you look at the movies, like back when movies were objectively better, just in terms of the way that they were put together, and it wasn't that long ago. It was before the whole woke tsunami really came in and washed through. Is that movies were always kind of catechetical. They were always, giving norms in terms of what was good and who the good guys were and who the bad guys were, and they'd been used, for propaganda effects and everything like that for a long period of time. I think the problem with the stuff that you get out of the explicitly Christian content sometimes, a lot of the time, and with the movies now with woke, is that they're so heavy-handed. They're drawing so rather than being catechetical, I don't know, in a more subtle fashion, or it's in
a confident manner. It's about confidence.
Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying.
If you're confident, you don't it's like what C.S. Lewis said. You don't pick up a science textbook that says humanist science. It's just imbued into the textbook itself. So the idea is that if you're confident in your worldview having its kind of normative, high ground in society, you don't have to shove it down in such desperate and transparent proselytizing ways. You can be subtle, and it can be smooth, and it can be clever and very just relaxed, because it's not like I've got to push everything I can onto you in this moment of attention that I've gotten from you. And I think that's what's going on today, is that a lot of this heavy-handedness comes out, and you're able to see it more clearly when a worldview lacks confidence in its ability to maintain its hegemonic status in the culture. Like when it's like, we're worried that, we really need to make sure everything is very transparently clear. These are your instructions. Next scene. These are your instructions about this relationship pattern. Here's the next scene. These are your instructions. A big plant-based dinosaur is just as strong and mighty as a carnivorous dinosaur. These are your instructions. Next scene. These are, it's like, please just tell a good story. Please just spend all your time on that. And your worldview, if it's confident and relaxed, will come out. And it does come out, because they're still trapped in the worldview of a Christ-haunted society that we're in today.
Yep.
So I want to go to this. What's that?
Amen, I said.
So let's go to battling to the end. I want to go pick up your notes again that you sent me in our last interview, our
Sure.
discussion we had on this topic, because you know you have some good notes for people. Battling to the End is Gerard's last book. It's enigmatic. Last time we talked, we kind of got through the intro and maybe a little bit of chapter one. I don't remember, but we can pick up where we left off, and we don't have to give equal amount of time to every chapter, as of course you didn't do in your YouTube. But let's go to chapter 2. Do you have any thoughts about chapter 2 by memory, or what do you remember about that chapter?
I do. It's well, there's a lot. There's a lot in there, and a lot of chapter 1 sets up chapter 2. So
chapter 2 is called
Clausewitz and Hegel.
All right. Oh yeah, we did a little bit of that. I want to do any more of that. All right, we've done that. Enough for I'm giving you an intro to your intro is what I'm doing in this series with you, so I'm setting people up to want to go to your intro to then go read the book. Battling to the End right here.
Well, yeah,
for those who are watching on video, Battling to the End is the book.
Where
there we go. I wanted to go into this point you made on your slide. Let me see if I can find it here. And it's about you were talking about this notion of there is no the dual and reciprocity in chapter 3.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about war and trade. Now that's interesting because we've lived in the last administration. There was a lot of talks about you in the presidential administration of America. We had a lot of talk about like trade wars with China and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about how trade is a less violent form of war, right? It's a less violent way of allowing reciprocity to take place without it coming to blows in a physical, direct sense, right?
Yep.
So you expand a little bit upon that, because that's a thing that, I mean, we think about trade wars, but the idea is not just trade wars, but just ordinary trade as a type of warfare. Why?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way Girard brings it out is he's looking at Clausewitz, and of course Clausewitz looking at Napoleon and his continental embargo of England during the Napoleonic War, and how Napoleon was continually dragged into further conflict by his own logic because and ultimately conflict with Russia because they failed to uphold the continental embargo. And so Clausewitz is reflecting on this and noticing that trade is an absolutely essential component into warfare. And so Clausewitz is bringing in trade and politics and putting this all into his theory. But what Girard notices is that or what he's able to bring out is that trade is a way by which reciprocity is able to be controlled within a specific established framework, so that, I think a direct quote from the text, he's like, if I go to the store, I want a baguette, you have a baguette, I give you some money, you give me the baguette, and we've achieved settlement. So what would have been a rivalry over this baguette is we have an institution which allows for us to be able to exchange these kinds of things. But this is both motivated on either side by a desire for appropriation. So these kinds of acquisitive relationships are all bound up within a pattern of desire, acquisitive mimesis, that is opposite to or different from charitable relations, where things are just being done as a total gift towards the other. So Girard is critical of those kinds of people who are saying that trade is a more peaceful form of war, and therefore there's no violence that goes into trade, or there isn't the logic of rivalry that's motivating trade underneath of it. So
are you using the word violence in the classical sense of physical violence, or are you using something else?
Well, yeah, that trade is basically the institution that allows for the violence not to be physical violence, right?
So what is that violence? Energy? It's an attitude of violence, attitude of aggression.
It's acquisitive mimesis, right? So it's the appropriation of the object that
a baguette is an object of desire that you saw other people on TV eating, and so you want it, and that's a form of violence to get it at a store. Come on.
No. It's that it's the problem of violence that results from acquisitive mimesis, right? So that if I reach for the object, let's say you have a whole bunch of baguettes, you didn't really care about those baguettes before because you had them, but if I go and reach for one, well, then suddenly you really care about that baguette, and now it's something worth fighting over. But if you set up a if you set up a price for it, and you can get this medium of exchange for the baguette, then I can give you that, and I can have the baguette, and you can have
and pricing works as a signal of like mimetic signals as well. Like if it's too high, then it's like, wow, man, maybe a lot of people love this, because this is a hard stumbling block to afford this $20 baguette that Whole Foods is selling. Maybe a lot of people have a high status, a lot of high status people buy this piece of food, right? And so it's like, well, I want to be a part of that status, so I'll pay for that higher priced. If it's too low, sometimes it's like, well, must not be good.
It's probably not a good baguette. Yeah. It's so funny. And this is kind of a completely different aside, but I was thinking about, price and value and the way that these things kind of work in our economy. And I think that there's basically two different kinds of goods. There's goods that are basically supply and demand driven, right? So the price is basically established by supply and demand. Then there's this whole other category of goods, and they're you can call them luxury goods, you can call them conspicuous consumption
goods.
Yeah, and these are just totally motivated by the mimetic dynamics of who you are or who you appear to be when in the possession of these kinds of goods as a result of other people.
Like some salons, they charge you $11 for a haircut, and in other ones it's the same basic haircut for $200 or something.
That's right. That's right. But you got to say that you got your haircut at that place, or by that person. And so you can just see how in a lot of economic theory, where you get these wild or very, very strange from the point of view of mimetic desire, I don't know, armchair psychologies, where like you talk about the fundamental problem of economics is that there's a scarcity of goods and an infinite measure of desire, that human beings are rational rational economic creatures. And then you can see how they get things that are partially right, just in terms of ordinary goods that aren't being driven so much by mimetic interplay, being settled by supply and demand of whatever resources are available, etc. Versus these mimetic goods as they're really driving things. And so anyway, that's a I don't know how we got on to the different kinds of value.
Yeah, because we're talking about trade as violence. Yeah, I'm just going through your notes in chapter 3 here, so it's good. It's all on topic, because we're just looking at your introduction to battling to the end and getting lessons and life lessons and ideas that we can pull from it together. So
yeah,
go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Sorry.
Decisive battle and cash payment are equivalent, though settlement is less frequent in war than it is in trade.
Yeah, that's right. So if we do the exchange of the baguette, where I give you the money and you give me the baguette, we have a settlement. It's over. There's no more generally chance for rivalry to break out. Whereas in warfare, you can have a decisive battle that really brings things to a close, but the settlement, even in the case of a decisive battle, is less frequent. So most of the time in warfare, you have a battle and it's indecisive in terms of how it goes on, and so the warfare continues on, and the extremes tend to continue to escalate. Even if you get a decisive battle, you can have a decision, but that doesn't mean that those two countries are necessarily going to forget about what happened before, and that 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, you're not going to have a return of an even more explosive amount of violence within the next conflict. So the great superiority of trade, aside from the fact that it lifts so many people out of poverty, it creates all this great wealth, from the point of view just of the escalation to extremes, is that it's such a superior institution because it has rules and regulations for settlement, and it can bounce around from one situation to the next without this buildup of hostility between all of the participants. So it's a kind of, I think, I don't know if I have the quote on here, but trade as a kind of low intensity warfare, and war as a high intensity.
So that would seem to suggest that when there's an out and out trade war, that the catacomb of trade is starting to lose its power to dam up the passions of war, right? Right.
Well,
It's starting to break down at the seams of the dam. If the dam of trade is holding back mimetic reciprocal violence in out direct forms, whether it's proxy wars or direct wars or armament wars like a Cold War or something, trade, when it starts to become a trade war, is like it's kind of the degenerate final stage of the dam of trade holding back physical conflict, right?
Well, that's right. And trade, because it's still the same logic of appropriation, and for nation states, Girard, they go back and forth in the dialogue saying, okay, well, if this is true, then can trade control war? Can we hold back war simply by going to trade? And this is where Girard says, if you adhere to a good form of capitalism and everything else seems to go well, because eventually, if you get competition between states, such as we have right now, trade gets brought in as an instrument of warfare. So you get tariffs, you get competition, you get the sanctioning of different companies who are involved in different activities because they get subsumed under the warfare, the warfare priorities of the state. So it's easy for what holds trade together to break down and then to get subsumed into the ordinary logic of mimetic rivalry.
So you have your other point in this chapter 3 notes is, can trade control war within bounds? Now, this presents an interesting thing, because I was thinking about I watched Errol Morris's documentary on Steve Bannon. I don't know if you've seen it.
No,
Errol
I have
Morris
not.
is a documentary filmmaker that, he gets into his famous war movie, Fog of War. He gets into Thin Blue Line. Different movies are all about, exploring people up close and historical events. And Bannon tells this story about how, there's this Vietnam War, and these veterans go off to fight. I mean, these people go off to fight in this war, and then they come back and they're ashamed and they're disrespected from what happens, and there's no conclusion. And they go, and there's like an event where there's like flags on display for America, and it says on the flag, "Made in Vietnam." Just a few years after the war, just not too many years after the war's concluded, there it is, "Made in Vietnam" or something. Or maybe it was a shirt or something patriotic that said "Made in Vietnam." And I think, and he was talking about how, what a shame that was, that, we go these wars, we can't conclude them. And then look at, here we are, these people get torn apart for this thing. And then the humiliation is their jobs are shipped out and they're being made by their former enemy. I mean, how terrible. And then I contrast that with like Ron Paul's approach to Vietnam War, where he says, we spent all these years trying to stamp out communism as it was invading that area, lost all these lives, and then look what we were able to achieve once we just started trading with them. We get along with them to this day. We trade, and we're not having to kill each other. And why couldn't we have just done the trade part, all the way through, rather than going through the futility of having a hot war, right? And so I don't want to go too far in those topics, but I do like to take Girard's work. This is what I do, and put feet to them to show how they affect these issues that we're dealing with. So how would I think those two different attitudes about war and trade provide some kind of spark for discussion about this statement: can trade control war within bounds? You said,
Yeah, well, I think it's really important to hold on to Girard's insight, where in there that there's a continuum between trade and war, and that it's the same logic. So this is I don't want to make too much of the point, because it's very clear that trade is the superior alternative to war. But just
so Ron Paul's right that we shouldn't be going to war; we should be trading with people. But then there's this critique of free traders that needs to be made too. So it's complicated.
Well, it is, but it's also important to recognize, like, to not be totally utopian about trade, that there's still a whole bunch of violence that goes into trade. So the economy is wonderful, the free market is wonderful, it's the best. But
the violence of destroying factories in middle America, right?
Well, and all of the inequality. So we talk about globalization, right? So globalization in terms of for the whole world
Sweatshops.
is
Yeah.
it well, it's the violence that's in sweatshops, but it's a net benefit for the whole world because it's lifting a whole bunch of impoverished nations out of poverty, but it's shipping people's jobs from the developed world out
So is
into
it a
the rest
great
of.
middling out? Is it a great middling out into everybody's just kind of relatively middling poor?
Well, I mean, to get into our own present historical situation, I think we're at the midst of a real crisis of the way in which our economies have been set up and run over the last several decades. But that will get us pretty far afield from the theoretical points that Gerard's making here
But the theory is worthless if it can't be applied to real life.
Oh no, it can. It's just we'd have to back up and go and talk about how it is that we got into this into the present mess. And I mean, it's not like you said. There's a direct bearing of relation because we'll see that if the economic relations really break down and if the rivalry really gets going between the different nation states and their own national interests, well, we'll see how trade gets totally subsumed into the pathology of national interest and war fighting, and where trade becomes impossible and where it's revealed to belong to the same logic of appropriation and competition that goes into acquisitive mimesis.
I just think it's interesting the mimetic psychic phenomenon of like you're picking up an object that has a symbolic power to you, and yet it's made in the image of it's made by a country that you've had a former conflict collectively with, and that mimetic revulsion from that, that like, wait a second, why is the other making something so sacred and close and near to my heart? And there's an interesting thing there to think about.
Yeah, well, there was a book. It's a pretty good book. There's some problems with it, but Ideas of Consequences by Richard Weaver. It's kind of a bit of a classical conservative text, and he talks about just the kind of moral horror where in the middle of broadcasts over what was going on in World War II, you'd have commercials for laxatives and cleaning products, and so just this integration, the market being driven by the forces that are driving it, and the way in which it props things up and maintains them, creates all of these kinds of disjunctions. And you can think about, you'll be watching maybe news report of some terrible, horrifying incident, and then it'll cut to a commercial of the most inappropriate in terms of the continuity of whatever you just watched. So this is kind of the chaos of the market and capitalism injected into everything that we do.
I think they did that. There was something like that. Was January 6th or something? They went to like Popeye's chicken commercial or something.
Something like that. I think
like
it was
that?
when they just started. I think it was when the Ukraine war started, and CNN cut to a chicken a cowboy dancing to
yeah. That was what it was. Okay.
I think so. And it's like the bombs are dropping in the background, and yeah.
Is that, did they do the split screen thing? Is that what they?
That's right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Although it's
the banality of capitalism, right? But
well, yeah, that's exactly right. And so you have these two different streams and patterns which are totally normalized and institutionalized within our own understanding of things, but they create this disjunction of the narrative of the events that you're trying to describe. And so it's a similar kind of thing where you have that example of seeing the flag made by the people you were just fighting, and that's just a part and package of the whole market system.
Here's a quote you have from Rene Girard at page 60 in this chapter. Commercial relations have nothing to do with moral relations. They involve reciprocity regulated by money, which is quite different. Let us suppose that moral relations are of another order, since they presuppose forgiveness, charity, in other words, a total gift.
Yeah, this is what I think is so important, is just to recognize that as good as the trade and market are, that they're still being run by the logic of mimetic competition, of mimetic rivalry.
Do they have to be though? Like, let's think about that. Not really.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that they just intrinsically are, because they involve the appropriate. It's acquisitive mimesis. It's the appropriation of an object that belongs to someone else, and as soon as you want
what is the object? status, money, whatever.
Whatever the property is. And
is that violent inherently? That's just mimetic. It's not violent. It's not.
Well, it's the move to appropriate it, and the move to appropriate it, which increases its value in the eyes of the person who holds it, and then who then wants it more than ever as soon as someone else is trying to appropriate it. It's not, you don't want to.
I mean, look, you and I are both market actors as we speak. We're both to some extent making money talking about these ideas.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be inevitable that this is all about appropriating some status or some money or some esteem or something. You can just do something from love or do something from true wonder or creativity. I mean, it doesn't have to be all this boiled down,
no. And so this
is to what markets are doing.
Yeah. So one of the things that, Girard is keen on, and it's a concept that he's developing all the way through, is that even where you're in a situation that is mimetic, and even maybe more mimetic in the violent sense, than trade, even within warfare, is there's a stance that you can get into and that you can adopt that is different from the primacy of victory or the winning at all costs, which is the primacy of battle, wherein you can recognize the dignity of the other person in whom you're engaged with. And so Jesus says, give away all your possessions and don't do the money game, right? He says you cannot serve God and mammon, and he's very forceful and he's very explicit about that. That it is a completely different order. And I think that's, sorry, go ahead.
You're saying that's a statement Jesus made for all of us to do, or?
Well, I mean, I think
if he actually made that as a, normative standard we should all do, then that would be a lot of disobedience if we're not doing that.
Well, it would be a lot of disobedience, but I think it's an amount of disobedience that Jesus anticipated. It's the same thing in terms of sexual relations too. He said, even just ordinary lust of looking at someone and wanting to appropriate them. This is the same logic of the same pattern of desire. So if you want to be perfect, renounce all that too. And so you get some small groups of Christians who really do renounce everything. But I don't think Jesus expected that everyone would be able to do it, or that everyone would. But at the same time, that we could still participate in his life and be Christians and do the best that we can, given where we're at and whatever we're engaged with in our own projects and dreams and aims. And some of these are natural goods and they're appropriate. So
Jerry Boyer, who is a fellow Girard fan of Girard and a friend of mine, and he says that that passage, in his book, The Maker versus the Takers, he says that that's in reference to the rich young ruler was a political figure who basically had gained his wealth through crony means. And so the intention of the passage is not to make some kind of declarative statement against gaining wealth, but rather to say, and he goes in through a whole exploration of, like, when he condemns wealth, it's always in Judea where there was crony wealth belt, and in the Galilean region there was not that crony-based wealth capital accumulation. And so his sermon on wealth being a problem is usually in the context of an audience that's gaining it through using political coercion to gain it. So that kind of corporatism, or it's not; those are terms that are not quite appropriate, but modern terms. But that kind of thing, crony political power gained wealth, is what he's really condemning there.
No, I think that's a completely ridiculous interpretation. I don't think you could support that anyway in the text. And even if you could say that in the case of the rich young ruler, there's everything else that Jesus says lines up with the theme that he's always advancing, which is that you cannot serve God and money. That the best thing that you can do is to renounce everything. And once you get the logic of everything that Girard's showing us, is that you can precisely see the logic of why Jesus is doing that. Is that all of this move towards appropriation, whether it be money, sexual status, political, whatever it is, all of this is according to a pattern of desire which leads to conflict, which leads to zero-sum competition and rivalry. And
isn't that kind of like a similar stance of, like, pacifism, like this idea of renouncing all accumulation of wealth is kind of like a pacifistic cop-out. Like, it's a way of saying, well, it's not the same, but it's a similar parallel move. And the way I'm looking at it, because I'm like, if you just say, okay, I'm going to renounce all wealth like Tolstoy and go live in the forest, well, yeah, that's cute, but like that's just not how civilization is going to function. So Jesus obviously didn't really mean for you to aspire to that level. Like he doesn't want you to do that, actually.
Well, I mean,
Just
so
like he doesn't want you to just be a total pure pacifist in the face of grave wickedness and violence. So I would
well,
see the same thing with kind of like that's like an economic pacifism, to put it.
it's true. No, I think that's right. But you know, and Jesus leaves open. There's two different kinds of things, right? So there's what's going to be the response for individuals as they're in societies with other people, right? And then there's going to be what's the ideal response? What would be the perfect response if you were able to? So is self-defense totally legitimate? Yeah. But what would be the more perfect response? The early Christian witness is the witness of martyrdom, right? So that if you're being persecuted for the faith, especially that you'd be willing to be a witness.
Wouldn't it be considered though an asterisk if you have like children or people who are weaker than you that are under your care, kind of to like say, I will be a martyr? Like, do you think Jesus would be like, yeah, that is the perfect response? While your toddler is left to be killed by a vicious person. I don't think so. I don't think it goes.
No, and I think this is why the individual. I think you really have to put the emphasis on the individual and who Jesus is speaking to, because you know, you can make that decision for yourself, but I don't think it's right to impose it on somebody else, right?
Which you kind of are if you take that.
That's right. So if you don't
have people that are depending on you for their protection.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where you get into the whole.
I think that needs to be applied to the economics here. I'm not going to let that go because we're unpacking this. You can't just say, "Let me be poor," when people need you to feed them, or you know, to survive in a very economically perilous way. Like if you're living in Stalin's starvation campaigns in Ukraine, you know, you don't have time to renounce the food. You're going to grab the bread and feed it to the people you have, so you don't have to be cannibals. I mean, so.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you get into the stories of those kinds of situations, or in the concentration camps where people would actually offer up their life to save someone else. But there's I really think that, it gets into a whole bunch of this question was a central question for the early church, just in terms of how things were going to be organized. You see it right away. So in the Acts of the Apostles, you have, well, initially in Jerusalem, everyone came together. They're so excited. This new thing is happening. They're filled with the Holy Spirit. There's miracles going on all around, and they just pool all their wealth together. And they share everything in common, and whatever anyone needs, they have, and they distribute it, and they're not worried about gain or appropriation from each other. But you can even see that this, which was practiced in Jerusalem, St. Paul is having to write to is it the Corinthians, where he's saying, like, look, you're having your Eucharistic feast, and you got poor people who can't afford to bring food to the table, and you're leaving them outside while the rich people are. So
because a lot of the people who were early Christians were rich, which is weird. People,
especially
remember that.
It seems to come out and to be the case, especially in the Corinth church.
Why do you think that was, by the way?
Well,
any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, so
it was because like today, like early adopters tend to be people who are able to go outside of their local culture, or have the financial means to travel around, or consider a new novel idea or something. Maybe.
Well, I think that last bit is really key, is the leisure that comes from looking, like, you need, in order to be in the world of ideas, you need to not be focused on your trade,
basic survival.
Yeah. And I love in the book of Acts where it says, when Paul arrives at the Areopagus in Athens, and it's like the people here did nothing except wait for some new idea to be told or heard, right?
There's kind of a little comedy there.
Well, it reminds me of this space on the internet, where you're having conversations, where the people who are interested in conversations and having these dialogues, we do nothing all day except wait around for some new idea to be told or heard, and what an opportunity to go in and to preach the gospel. But yeah, I think that's exactly it. Is there's that. You have to, there was miracles going on. So how do you explain, the dynamic and the power of God that's being displayed as the preaching went out? And that probably got the interest of a whole number of people, and then just being swept up in this whole new I wanted to come back to the brilliant thing too you said about the inscription to the unknown God. Well, as much as the unknown God was also, it was wonderful what you said in terms of, and all the other people that you could potentially think of sacrificing and deifying, but also too the unknown God of this God of love who's breaking through and is totally utterly foreign to all of those
Right.
other kinds of.
So the unknown disposition that God represents as well.
Right, and
just
so
like there's gods of love and gods of war and gods of merrymaking and gods of this or that. Here's another new feeling, a certain type of way. That's what the kids say, right? We said this last time. Feel a certain way, a type of way.
But that new way just being totally foreign to the kind of sacred that people knew and participated in before,
which was much more transactional, kind of, right?
Well, and the liberation and the freedom and the joy and the charity that would have really been alive there. And so I think that would have been enormously appealing and charismatic and interesting, especially to people who had kind of seen it all, tasted it all, done it all previously. That no, here is something that is genuinely new. Everything before was nothing new under the sun, and then Jesus says, behold, a new thing.
And we got to give credit to Jesus here too, because we wouldn't even be able to talk about these things. You were talking about how wealthy you had to be back then to have the leisure to think about a new idea like Jesus. Look at us, we're kind of like working class people, and we're able to have this kind of freedom to use technology and to have this indulgence. Not that it's indulgence, because I think it is a survival guide that we're trying to do, but being able to unpack ideas of high concept while still being not an aristocratic, super wealthy elite in terms of what we would consider today super wealthy, that people who are from modest means can enjoy such opportunities of learning ideas together. We have to give credit to Jesus for that, because his movement is what allowed for us to have this privilege to do this. Otherwise, we'd be having to sit in a situation where we're just focused on trying to get our next meal and provide for a place to put our head in at night to sleep in or whatever,
No, I completely agree. It's a wonderful opportunity, and let's hope that that humanity can choose, just the basic kind of positivity of the gospel, and that you can have something like real peace, not the peace of the lies and domination that empire and violence always wants, but real peace, real creativity, real flourishing, real dynamism, and real prosperity going forward.
So I want to make another point about my critique of what I call economic passivism. I don't know if that's a thing, but I'm coining it now.
I know what you mean now. You've developed the concept out of Jesus's insistence that you can't serve God.
I don't think that's. Yeah. I don't know if that's necessarily correct. I kind of like Jerry's take there, but I'm open. I'm open to learning and
yep.
But anyways, another thing is, like, if you go that other way, you get into a lot of narcissistic conceit as well, of like, the ascetic life going too far, right? This idea, like I was reading a blog about a pastor who went over to a country, and he went to a monastery, and they had like an underground place where these monks had entombed themselves to die, like they were getting sucking air from a straw or something, and like getting food in. Yep. And that was a way of showing their renunciation of their sinful desires. Do you see how that's it's like you're going so far to be against the pagan desires that you end up becoming literally embracing immurement, which was a ritual sacrificial practice that ancient societies did, where they entombed live victims to bless and consecrate the building of a new temple or city, like in Jericho. And here you are, you're going so far mimetically against paganism that you fall right back into it. And so we have to be careful about this kind of economic pacifism of like, look how holy I am, that I would not even get any of his desires in my heart and pursue them. I would just orient them all to self-abasement.
Yeah, well, you can't be the monk who goes around saying that he's the humblest monk that's ever existed, and that's not real holiness, right? And so Girard is great in Things Hidden, where he brings out something that had definitely been a part of the Christian tradition, which was this kind of pathological asceticism, wherein the asceticism.
Does he do this in Battling to the End you're talking about here?
No, this isn't. Okay. This is in Things Hidden.
Okay.
There is a kind. There's there's a kind of masochism, or there's a kind of asceticism, or there's a kind of denial that is really just a disguised form of a seeking to appropriate power under one guise or another. And you can see this too in terms of, you know, all the things that people are willing to go through, and all of the humiliations and abuses people are willing to endure in order to gain some powerful position or some recognition or whatever it is. And so obviously that whole thing is still caught up in the same dynamic of if we like, commercial relations that Girard is talking about, which are different from moral relations. Where in moral relations, you're renouncing property or your sexuality, not because you hate property or because you hate sexuality, but because it actually makes you more free to love. And it makes you more free to not be tied up with it. So if your move is to actually be liberated to love more, to participate more in the life of Jesus, and to not be caught up and entangled within these kinds of acquisitive relations, then that would be good. But there's
and
a whole
love
bunch of
others more. That's
right. Love others.
You can say all day long, "Oh, I'm loving Jesus,"
I'm loving.
you're a total.
No, love does. Love
know,
does.
right.
Yeah, love does. And if you're doing that, then that's good, but a lot of the time it can just be a kind of self-righteousness, disguised form of narcissism. Or sorry, go ahead.
You're saying the accumulate, I mean, and I'm not trying to get into this fully, but I just want to, as we go through this chapter, so you're suggesting that your interpretation of Girard and more importantly, your interpretation of the Gospels concludes you to believe that accumulating any money is trapped within a mimetic matrix of violence? That you're doing that? Or
well, I think that would be.
I don't know if I go with there, but I'm open to listening to this.
Sure. Well,
because Jesus collected it. But Jesus collected a purse with Judas, you know? I mean, Judas collected his purse. So he had a purse. So the moment he went somewhere and he's like, all right, here, talk to Judas. And then they put their coin in. Did he acquire, was that acquisitive, a violent desire? No, I don't think so.
Well, I think
so if he did it, it's okay for me.
I know. I think it's a bit, I think it's a bit too, categorical in terms of it's trying to I think Jesus
what's
says
what's it
so the looking for this an instance wherein Jesus had to use money or holding on to a purse or
not
something
an instant,
like,
it's how he did his ministry. He had to have
the
bills.
And he received donations. It was interesting that his preaching in Galilee was actually it's hard to, I mean, we're getting far off track here, but the scandal.
No, this is on track, because we have to unpack these lessons. This is what things is about.
But it's, where Jesus got his money is quite scandalous. It was Luke says that it was the women who provided the money for Jesus and the apostles' means while they were traveling and preaching through Galilee. And these weren't just any women. You had courtesans, prostitutes, women of the court. It was Joanna, Herod's wife of Herod's steward. So these are people in playing the power politics game and appropriating tax dollars, and these were very worldly women, and who often had the scorn and the contempt of the wider culture. And here he is receiving his bread from women who had considered to be complete and total outcasts and unintegratable and have no right to participate in any kind of the religious
sex workers, sellouts,
sex workers,
IRS agents.
How can you be a prophet of God and be receiving money from prostitutes to carry on your ministry? And then to travel around with them, even more scandalously. So
that's not a sin that he's using that money.
No, and I think
so. That's what I'm trying to get at. It's okay to use money. You don't have to feel like I'm sinning slightly here.
No, well, I think the point is just to recognize exactly what I think Girard is doing a great job just in terms of making the contrast between the acquisitive relations and the moral relations. And Jesus is saying, look, to be perfect is just to be God, is to desire what God's desire, and he's just total self-giving. It's Jesus on the cross where he's just totally self-giving. Look, are you going to go through your life, and is it going to be messy, and is there going to be the exchange of money? But it's like, even when you have money, then what do you do with that money? How do you spend it? What kind of person are you with it? Are you buying things simply for conspicuous consumption so that other people will envy you and to further intensify that pattern of desire? Or are you giving your alms in secret without the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing, or vice versa, and making good? Are you running your business in an honest fashion, or are you trying to swindle vulnerable people in order to make a profit? So I think it's just
So there's a godly way of being a billionaire.
Yes, I think so. I do think
that's
so.
what I want
Yeah,
to
yeah,
do.
yeah. I think any, and I think that what Christians
But you still need to be on guard. It's like a constant paradoxical tension.
That's right.
Even though
right.
there's a godly way, don't turn into a jerk about it, and
Well,
don't turn into don't turn into a workaholic sloth, which is what slothfulness actually means, which is working for the sake of working and toiling.
Well,
it's not actually just laziness like we think of slothfulness. It's actually about vain working, in my understanding.
And sloth too is as much about vain working as it is also working to distract yourself from the obligations of love that you actually owe to God and to neighbors.
So many people do that in America and the West. Yeah,
that's right. And so I think
Shame
what the church, Saint John Chrysostom, who was scathing, really hit on. He was in Constantinople, and of course the conspicuous consumption of the nobility there, and the disparity between the rich and the poor in the city, and all coming together in the same church. And he was scathing to the nobles in terms of their use of wealth. And what he recognized was that, Jesus says, to whom, and of course it's not just in terms of wealth that he's referring to here, but to whom much is given, much is required. If God has given you great gifts, whether they be your talents or whatever else, you have a corresponding great obligation to give back. So if you've received $1 billion, it's you've got to find a creative way to give back that $1 billion, and reinvesting that $1 billion to get more money to give back more is totally appropriate. That's working hard to create good fruit.
And I believe, just as a side, that I've talked about this before with other folks, maybe you, Jordan Greenhall. I think I talked about this idea that I've thought about called like this performance of the fish and the loaves thing, how that's like a prophecy kind of, where Jesus is basically saying it's a performative prophecy of saying, like, your way of providing for each other should try to overcome the limitations of what we consider scarcity, right? The miracle is like, I'm not taking this fish and cutting it up in little pieces. Okay, you get a little tiny piece, everybody get a little piece. Like that's succumbing to the framework of scarcity and saying, I'm doing the best I can with what I have, right? But rather, Jesus is saying, like, no, you, in imitation of me, should do actions within a market, you could call it, or not, wherein you are going to overcome the limitations of scarcity and feed everybody with a little. And so that idea is something that we should have in mind of curing cancers, because cancer is a type of scarcity of life and scarcity of health, and doing a lot with a little, right? Not having to have 70 drugs and cocktails of toxic side effects, but like doing little things to do great miracles that transcend and overcome the limitations of scarcity, whether it's energy too cheap to meter that doesn't pollute the earth and all these grand things. This is what Christians should be working towards. I just want to put that out there as we talked about this economic part of this.
No, I think that, it's definitely the case that, and Girard talks about, I think he's right when he talks about how science comes about through this process of desacralization, and that Jesus, and it's not, this is actually, there was great books on this written outside of Girard, just in talking about how Christianity freed up and made possible modern science as it emerged. It was also thought too that if you were a scientist, just studying the world was a vocation in terms of participating in the life of God. You're trying to understand God's creation from opening up and interpreting the book of nature, and seeing the wonder in all of God's creation and how everything fits together. And the vocations to invent great new technologies to help a whole number of people. This is all participation within the will of God, and is definitely where we're supposed to go to. And so it's totally appropriate to do to show from the multiplication of the loaves and fishes that God's way is not the same way of the vision of scarcity and death that we're so constantly used to, and that we have to because we have faith and because we trust in him, we can imagine that there are other ways of doing things that do really transcend this. But at the same time too, that the even greater spiritual dimension, where you have the multiplication of the love of God, gifted down and given to human beings, which doesn't know this scarcity at all. I mean, and so you see this breaking
or unconditional, pure, no model obstacle, no catch.
No gotcha,
no strings attached,
no traps, no.
And that's why
yeah.
and that's why Girard says that Jesus, God's love, is totally unattractive to us in some sense, because it's no strings attached, and we like things that have the obstacle because it signals to us that many people would desire it or hard to get, right?
Well, this is where you get into this is a great, because it goes right into whole Girard's discussion of internal mediation to innermost mediation. It's like, well, are you a romantic or are you a true romantic? Is I think how that would go.
Unpack that some more.
Well, I was just saying, like, I think you're right that, we can so often only be driven by what opposes us, and fascinated by the obstacle, and obsessed with the rivalry as the sign that we're engaged in the real thing. And, that's romanticism in terms of, and I don't mean romantic desire in terms of self-originating.
But look how many people are attracted to governments and powerful figures that use vicious coercion and force to get their will done. People like that. And so we like a God, and I'm not going to go too far with this because I do want to get to the next point here, but we like a God that feels the same way as that. Like, watch out. He might get you. He might strike you down. He might beat you up. He might torture you if you don't, he may not love you. We like that kind of God rather than the real God that is totally no strings attached, unconditional, no obstacle, no hard to get energy, just truly, totally. But there is a kind of hard to get energy too with God, that because of the feeling of of what happens on the cross and that feeling of God's silence. So there is a little bit of that with God, with Christ, this feeling of like, where are you, God, when in the midst of this eternal mimetic escalation that we're in right now of conflict and problems and corruption.
Of course, if we're really suffering, and we remember God's words, then we can recognize that he's right there with us. But yeah.
Well, what I want to ask is, so it's commonly, I say this, that if we actually imitate Jesus and the church would actually imitate Jesus, it would be so attractive that people would really want to be a part of it even more. And it would solve a lot of problems. But it makes you wonder. I thought, when I say that, sometimes I'm like, but would they really? Because they like the hard to get leaders. They like hard to get tough. They do. I mean, we all do. Human beings like heroes. That's what you're going to get into with your hero thing, I think, with totalitarianism and so forth. But this idea of like, they like their heroes to have that tough, hard to get kind of push-pull dynamic of mimetic desire. And so if the church was actually imitating that unconditional grace and unconditional self-sacrificial love and unconditional self-giving, maybe we would be even more unattractive to the broader world community. I don't know. It's kind of hard to see how those play together,
it's almost
because
like
in some sense it would win people over, but in some sense it might be so weak, as they would say it, or
well, this is very Nietzschean. And it's interesting too that we were just talking about the kind of the class differences in terms of where the gospel went originally out to, and a lot of that obsession with the most formidable rival and the fiercest obstacle, and the one who can do the most violence to everyone else as the most kind of token of superior being that you want to imitate and that you want to get close to. A lot of that is, these are bourgeois problems. These are problems of the nobility who have nothing else to do except meditate on their desires. Whereas, the Christians went out to the completely neglected and marginalized by the society, the poor, the true poor, and evangelization was just ran through at such a rapid clip, and a great fire went and spread throughout the whole of the Roman Empire, and just like in decades, and then over 2 centuries throughout the whole thing. And so maybe it's a sign of our decadence, of our civilization, where we don't think that we have any need of God because we're too busy being preoccupied with the rivalries that really concern us. And it isn't until some kind of loss that you really realize just how radically dependent you are and how much you really need love. I mean, it's interesting. You can commit yourself so much to the hell of mimetic rivalry, and that can so consume everything and be the source of all meaning, that making that jump to that whole other way of being can seem, odious, uninteresting. But then if you do, you realize, like you forget the strange innocence that you once knew, and how good something wholesome actually tastes, and just how different things can be from what seems like the only way it can be within the tunnel of mimetic rivalry.